first of all, why is it being scaled back, and what it was originally designed for? I mean, 20 years ago, when Putin revamped the whole victory parade, he said it was a demonstration of Russia's military capability, military hardware, and a show to any potential adversaries that Russia was militarily very, very strong. And that's what it's all been for the last 20 years or so. Even in the first year in 2022 of the special military operation, the 3-day military operation that is now over 1,500 days long, even then, Russia managed to put a whole load of tanks and missiles and aircraft, onto the parade square, onto Red Square, again as a show. So I think this year, where not a single tank appeared, and we're focusing on tanks because I think tanks are very symbolic, especially for the Russians. Where they're fighting at the moment in Ukraine is very close to Kursk, the Kursk battlefield in 1943, which a lot of the victory parade is symbolic of. It was the Battle of Kursk where Russia defeated the Nazis and was the beginning of the end of Hitler. Now, Russia in the Battle of Kursk managed to get 6,000 tanks onto the battlefield. They suffered over 1 million casualties, but they prevailed. Now, and that is what the victory parade is about, the Great Patriotic War, the 26 million people who died. It is remembrance of them. So when we wind forward to now, where, as we said, not a single tank appeared and very little military equipment, just soldiers, the symbolism is unbelievable. I mean, the humiliation for Putin must be unbearable. Now, why are we in this position? Well, Putin didn't feel that he could protect the parade from potential Ukrainian drone or missile strike. And we've seen Ukraine striking deep into Russia, absolutely decimating their oil industry, 1,500 kilometers into Russia. Now, Moscow is now well within range. And in fact, last week, a Ukrainian drone hit a building in Moscow. And Moscow is supposed to be the best protected city in the world. Putin has moved air defense from the front line in Ukraine, protecting his soldiers there, to protect Moscow. But, he's still not confident that he can do that. And the paranoia is unbelievable. It is understood that Putin is incredibly worried after seeing the Iranian regime, the leaders assassinated by the US and Israeli technology, apparently using the mobile phones of the mullahs and the leaders in Iran to target them. Putin's now banned any mobile phone anywhere near him. It's probably only he and my mother who use landline telephones to communicate these days. I mean, that is the state of paranoia. So it's a long way to say, so why are we in this position now where we've got Russian soldiers who are supported by North Korean soldiers? We know that Russia had to buy North Korean soldiers to fight on the front line, but are they also having to buy them to swell up numbers for the most important parade on the most important day in the Russian calendar? So, I think when you put all that together, the symbolism is unbelievable. The next thing, before we go on to talk about what he actually said, is who else was there? Now, not very many. I mean, a few other autocratic leaders. I mean, usually it's hundreds of leaders from all around the world. I mean, even last year, the Chinese president turned up. Now, he's certainly not this year, and the Chinese president and China very much distancing themselves from the war, Russia's war in Ukraine. And again, that is hugely symbolic. So I think when you put all that together for such an unbelievably important day, I mean, we have the British trooping the colour coming up, the biggest parade in Britain in a few weeks' time, which again is a national celebration. Although it reflects the King's birthday, but it is also a national celebration and remembrance for all those people who lost their lives in the Second World War fighting for Britain or with Britain. Now, there is no way that that will ever be scaled back. Admittedly, we don't have tanks driving around, but we do have thousands of soldiers. So again, when being a soldier myself, and I understand parades, I understand the symbolism of them, but to go off half cock as they've done, as I said, is humiliation. And for the Russian people, they haven't really been able to do justice to their 26 million forebears who lost their lives in the Second World War because Putin's too paranoid and won't take a risk of staging a full parade. But also the other thing is, that we know that he's really short of tanks. If he's using Second World War tanks on the front line, he doesn't want to have them driving up and down Red Square, because that would be even worse than having none at all, I expect. I must say the 7-minute video showing what the sort of Russian press statements were saying was, their latest, most modern, high-tech equipment was sort of bizarre. It was sort of, well, we haven't got the real stuff. We can't drive that across the parade ground. But here's a film, and I suppose those of us who are so imbued in this war now and have followed it for so long, and so aware of what AI and everything else can do now, are we really believing the images we're seeing there? I think nothing we're showing there is sort of Star Wars and changing the face of battle. Let's face it, if it was, they'd be using it on the front lines. I've talked a lot about tanks, but the Russian solution for tanks on the battlefield is to turn them into things that look like turtles or dandelions with armor protection that lends itself to the First World War, not to 2026. Conversely, Ukraine on its tanks is getting what we call hard kill defensive aid suites. This is the latest technology where sensors fire munitions at incoming drones and destroy them. Rather than the Russian thing is, well, let's put more armor and bits and pieces on our tanks, and hopefully, one of those levels of armor will destroy the drones. One technology is 2026 and Star Wars, if you like, and the others is sort of First World War. So I think that the whole thing sort of, it's a charade. It is, the parade today has been a charade, and those videos, again, I think, is Putin taking us all for idiots, or taking his people for idiots? I mean, do Russians really think that seeing a video of a submarine means they've got thousands of these things swimming around the sea? I mean, they're bonkers. I mean, we know the Russian Navy is in a pretty sorry state. The Black Sea Fleet has been destroyed by Ukraine, who doesn't even have a navy. And some of the Russian frigates and the famous Russian aircraft carrier, which belched around the Mediterranean, again, it actually shows an organisation that is living and has equipment in the past, not the future. Now, undoubtedly, Russian scientists, as again he praised them, are probably coming up with some pretty good kit. But it's one thing having prototypes and ideas. It's another thing of having military hardware on the front line, which is making a difference, which clearly at the moment it's not. Let us hope that the Victory Parade in 2026 is as important as the Battle of Kursk in 1943 for changing the direction of this war. I think there are a lot of things to consider here. The fact that Putin declared a 2-day ceasefire earlier on in the week, and President Zelensky then suggested that all the world leaders who are heading to Moscow shouldn't go because it might not be safe. And the fact, that you could see the visceral anger coming out of Putin about this. He had demanded this ceasefire, and this upstate, leader from Ukraine was ignoring him. Now, had it not been for President Trump coming in and forcing a 3-day ceasefire, then it is very likely that Putin would be in an even more difficult position. But the fact that he is in this position is really telling. I think when you unpick his speech And the most striking thing to me, we've heard Putin's speeches before. They usually go on for hours and hours and hours. 10 minutes for Putin is like one sentence for the rest of us. So I think that was very telling. And the fact that he was trying to blame NATO for this war is quite unbelievable. Now, the reason that he gives is for NATO's expansion eastwards, that he then had to attack Ukraine. But Ukraine had not joined NATO, however much it wanted to. NATO had sort of held off and said no, because they thought that would provoke Putin. So by using this as an argument, which it's just not true, but then we're used to half truths and propaganda and disinformation coming from Putin and from Moscow as well. But the reason that the old Soviet states joined NATO is because they feared Putin. It's sort of not the other way around. So again, it seemed pretty hollow. He was talking, his 3-day special military operation is now well into its 5th year, well over 1,500 days. And, the justification of it is getting more difficult. We are seeing in the Russian press for the first time, openly, people are showing dissent. Even Russian military commanders are now questioning Putin and questioning his war in Ukraine. And people, the rank and file in Russia, are suffering massively. We in the rest of the world are suffering because the price of oil, because of the war in Iran, is having an impact. Well, that's doubly bad for Russian people if actually they can get any petrol for their cars anyway. And the interest rates, inflation in Russia is out of control. Even yesterday, Putin was calling out to his oligarchs saying, you must put money into the economy. You must help me, with a real admission that the economy is in free fall, and he's running out. And because he can't get any money for his oil, and the great frustration for him, I suppose, is with oil over $100 a barrel, if he could sell it, he'd be earning a fortune, but he can't. So even the Russian coffers are running out of money. And I think, all of this is building ahead of steam. And with Putin perhaps now realizing this, and with President Trump hopefully, re-engaging, and his 3-day ceasefire might be a signal that he is, then, and I think the other thing which we have discussed is that Ukraine is really starting to get on the front foot. Slowly but surely, Ukraine forces on the front line are pushing the Russians back. Ukraine is now exporting military capability. The sort of inference is that they've got enough of their own, but they have become absolutely the masters of innovation and the fight on this contemporary battlefield, and they are using tanks again themselves, which is incredible. So the balance is, I think, slowly turning in favour of Ukraine, and turning against Russia. And whether the Russian people will accept this humiliation of the Victory Day parade and all the other ills that they're suffering, that is the big question. But I think, everybody just hopes for a just ceasefire and peace deal for Ukraine. And maybe this will be the turning point, like the Battle of Kursk was in the Second World War in 1943.